On a clear morning, with a few white clouds drifting lazily across the sky, the ground beneath my feet suddenly began to crack. Massive fissures appeared before my eyes, followed by large chunks of earth sliding down as if the very foundation was giving way under the weight of the luxurious new villas. Entire structures were sinking into the ground, walls buckling, windows shattering. In the distance, one of the grand homes suddenly tilted, then collapsed with a deafening crash, taking down walls and spilling debris across the soft earth like a monstrous wave. The chaos unfolded right before my eyes. The lake drained the once solid land, now buckling under its own weight while the villas crumbled into the mess. The luxury homes that had once promised wealth and exclusivity were now nothing more than an expensive pile of rubble. I could see the lake bed once full of life, now a barren wasteland, its precious water gone seeping into the earth, leaving behind a dry, cracked expanse. With every step, the ground beneath me sank deeper, and I knew this was no ordinary failed development. This was a complete collapse, irreparable. Everything was falling apart before me, moment by moment, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Karen, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room in her signature red suit, the beige high heels clicking against the polished floor with each deliberate step. Her presence was commanding, exuding an air of confidence that made it clear she was used to being in control. She was ambitious, no doubt, with a vision of turning the land surrounding the lake into a luxury resort, executive villas with private docks, infinity pools, and pristine lawns. She painted this vision to the community as a necessary upgrade, an inevitable step toward progress. But beneath the polished exterior, Karen was blinded by her desire for profit, and there was one thing she couldn't or wouldn't understand: the environmental cost of her plan. She wasn't concerned with the delicate ecosystem, the land's fragile stability, or the potential consequences of disturbing it. To her, the land was just a means to an end, and that end was financial success. Tension first flared when I tried to voice my concerns during the initial meeting. I presented technical data, environmental studies, and the risks of building on land that was unstable without proper ecological consideration. But Karen, with that same practiced smile, dismissed my warnings as nothing more than unfounded opposition. "We've consulted with experts," she said, waving my concerns away with a flick of her hand. "This project is necessary for the future of the community. It's a done deal." She didn't seem to care about the long-term interests of the community as long as her plans moved forward. For her, it wasn't about preservation. It was about increasing property values and securing a financial windfall. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a battle for the land. It was a battle against someone who didn't see the land at all. Our first confrontation set the tone for what would come: a battle not just of wills, but of worldviews. The first signs of trouble appeared quietly, almost innocuously, yet each one felt like a warning shot. One morning, I noticed bright orange survey stakes driven deep into the soft soil along the edge of my property near the lake. They bore the HOA seal, a symbol of authority I had once trusted. Crews were marking the ground, measuring distances, and snapping photos, all under the guise of preliminary utility planning. Nothing had been approved with me, the landowner. A few days later, I discovered shallow trenches cut along the narrow service path that led to the lake, where the runoff fed into the basin. When I confronted the workers, they shrugged. "Orders from the HOA," one said, as if that justified digging into someone else's land. Soon, motion-sensing cameras appeared along the perimeter, their red lights blinking every time I walked near the shoreline. Karen's influence was everywhere, her reach subtle but unnerving. Then came the first official letters warning me about unauthorized presence in areas I had walked and maintained my entire life. The absurdity of being accused of trespass on my own property hit me hard, but the goal was clear: intimidation. I spent nights walking the lake's edge, tracing the soft soil, seeing the first signs of erosion near the small inflow channels, and realizing that these small, seemingly harmless violations were damaging the ecosystem. Each survey line, trench, and camera was another piece of the puzzle. The HOA was slowly laying the groundwork for something much larger, and the land was already beginning to protest. The question gnawed at me: how far would they push before the consequences became impossible to ignore? The tension escalated quickly as I dug deeper into the paperwork surrounding the lake's sudden drainage. While reviewing the county records, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The HOA had submitted reclassification requests using an outdated 1961 topographical map, one that predated the creation of the lake itself. By doing this, they had bypassed mandatory environmental reviews, zoning restrictions, and wetland protections. What I had assumed was a local overreach now revealed itself as a coordinated manipulation of the system. Then came the fake environmental assessments. The HOA had hired a so-called consulting firm to produce reports claiming that lowering the water level would have no significant ecological impact. I traced the company's registration and discovered it was little more than a shell operation, no licensed engineers, no credible studies, just glossy documents meant to look official. Every recommendation, every reassurance they provided was built on falsehoods. When I confronted the HOA's property manager about these reports, her eyes flickered with unease, but she quickly masked it with practiced indifference. Karen, always composed in her red suit and beige heels, brushed off my questions with a thin smile. "Our experts say it's perfectly safe," she declared, though her voice lacked conviction. I realized then that the battle wasn't just about the land, it was about an entire system stacked against me. Corrupt channels, fake reports, and legal loopholes had been leveraged to silence any opposition. And now, standing at the edge of the partially drained lake, I understood the full scope of what I was facing. If I wanted to protect this land, I would have to expose both the manipulation and the people orchestrating it. The quiet erosion at the shoreline was no longer just soil, it was a warning, and I wasn't about to ignore it. By mid-morning, the lake had begun to reveal the true cost of the HOA's interference. Sections of the shoreline, once firm and stable, were now soft and collapsing underfoot. Small rivulets of water, once fed by the western springs, had been redirected into underground tanks for the villa construction, leaving the exposed lakebed cracked like a dry mosaic. Trees that had stood for decades, willows, cottonwoods, and even younger saplings planted by my father, leaned precariously, their roots clinging to soil that was no longer nourished. Vegetation along the banks withered, turning brown and brittle, while fish floundered in the remaining shallow pools. The ecosystem wasn't just stressed, it was screaming. Walking the perimeter, I began noticing more alarming signs. Subtle shifts in the terrain, tiny sinkholes forming near where survey stakes had been driven, and the faint smell of oxidizing clay rising from exposed sublayers that should never have been touched. Every indicator confirmed my worst fears. The soil beneath these planned villas could not support the structures, and every inch of this interference was destabilizing the land. It wasn't just about nature anymore. As I pieced together permits, HOA meeting minutes, and development plans, the financial motives became glaringly obvious. Karen and the board had fast-tracked deposits for the villas, ensuring that potential buyers were committed before any serious review could halt progress. Luxury villas, private docks, exclusive lakefront branding, it was never about community improvement. It was profit at any cost. The lake, my family's legacy, and the fragile ecosystem were merely obstacles to be engineered around, controlled, or removed. Anger and disbelief collided as I realized the scale of the deception. The HOA wasn't just negligent. It had actively manipulated zoning laws, environmental assessments, and permits to serve its financial agenda. And now, the land was starting to fight back. Cracks widened, trees shifted further, and the lakebed shrank daily. I knew the next phase was inevitable, the moment when the consequences of their greed could no longer be ignored. The soil was unstable, the ecosystem collapsing, and the truth about their motives would have to be exposed before the land and everything I had protected was destroyed beyond repair. The situation escalated when I finally managed to alert the county and state agencies about the lake's drastic drainage and the unstable soil beneath the construction zones. Inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, stepping carefully across the cracked lakebed. They frowned at the dry, exposed sediments and sinking ground, clearly recognizing that this was more than a routine review. Yet every official action seemed to be slowed, complicated by carefully crafted permits and reports that made the project appear legitimate on paper. Karen, impeccably dressed in her red suit and beige heels, met each inquiry with practiced poise. She paraded the fake environmental assessments and altered zoning documents like trophies, claiming full compliance. Her attorneys argued procedural technicalities, citing fast-tracked approvals and outdated maps as sufficient justification. The more I tried to explain the ecological risks, the more convoluted the process became. It was clear that the system had been manipulated from within. Every loophole, every forged signature, and every falsified report was part of a strategy to protect their financial stakes. Determined not to be silenced, I began meticulously documenting every irregularity: photographs of the cracked lakebed, video footage of shifting soil near foundations, correspondence with county offices, and records of unpermitted drainage, alterations. I compiled detailed reports emphasizing the direct connection between the HOA's actions and the environmental hazards unfolding before us. Public pressure began to build as I shared select evidence with the media and concerned neighbors. Local journalists started asking questions, citing the irregularities I had uncovered, and soon the HOA could no longer dismiss the situation quietly. Even Karen's calm facade showed cracks. Her smile tightened, her eyes flickered with unease, and she could feel that the narrative was beginning to shift. For the first time, the threat of legal accountability, combined with public scrutiny, began to slow their operations. But I knew the land itself was still at risk, and unless decisive action was taken, the damage would continue to escalate. The clock was ticking, and the next confrontation, one that could finally expose the full extent of the HOA's manipulation, was looming. It happened just after dawn. A massive section of the lakebed, near one of the partially constructed villas, gave way with a thunderous crack. Mud and clay erupted like a small landslide, swallowing construction equipment and leaving gaping holes where earth had once been firm. The ground trembled under my boots, and I could see water being sucked into the subsurface, leaving pools of stagnant, murky liquid. Birds scattered in alarm, their cries echoing across the valley. The community awoke to chaos. Neighbors poured out of their homes, smartphones in hand, capturing the destruction as it spread. Panic rippled through the HOA board members, who arrived Karen at the center, her red suit now seeming almost defiant against the devastation. The villas that had once been symbols of wealth and ambition now leaned precariously, their foundations cracking and shifting. Contractors shouted at each other, unable to salvage the structures fast enough, while inspectors frantically documented the disaster. I stood at the edge of the collapse, surveying the damage, feeling a mix of fear, relief, and determination. The lake, my family's legacy, had finally revealed the full extent of its protest. This wasn't a slow erosion anymore, it was a full-scale warning that the land could no longer be ignored. Karen's smug control, all her layers of permits and fake reports, collapsed along with the soil. I took a deep breath and began gathering neighbors, journalists, and authorities for a public confrontation. Evidence that had once been ignored, videos of shifting soil drone footage of the drained lake, and documented correspondence showing the HOA's manipulation was now undeniable. For the first time, the community could see the truth. The disaster was not random, nor a natural occurrence. It was the direct result of negligence, greed, and deliberate deception. Karen tried to speak to justify, to redirect blame, but no one listened. The ground beneath her feet, the foundation of her power had crumbled, and everyone could see it. This was the point of no return, the moment when the facade ended and accountability began. The story had shifted, and the battle would no longer be behind closed doors. The community center was packed, tension thick enough to taste. Chairs scraped against the floor as residents, journalists, and inspectors filled every corner, their eyes flicking nervously between the podium and the overflowing evidence I had brought. Karen stood at the front, red suit, immaculate beige heels planted firmly, her expression unreadable, but her posture stiff. The board members fidgeted beside her, clutching folders that suddenly seemed meaningless. I stepped forward, laying out the maps, drone footage, and soil reports on the table for everyone to see. The room went silent as the reality of what had been done hit them: the drained lake, shifting foundations, and the blatant misuse of permits and manipulated environmental reports. Whispers spread, tension climbing with each passing second. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "The land doesn't lie," I said, voice steady. "These documents, these images, they tell the truth she tried to hide." Eyes widened, phones lifted, cameras rolled. Everyone could see it, undeniable and stark. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. The room was no longer a meeting hall, it was the arena where the full consequences of greed and negligence would be exposed. I took a deep breath and began revealing the evidence I had painstakingly compiled over months. First, the original 1,961 topographical map, yellowed at the edges, showing the lake's true boundaries, long before the HOA tried to reclassify it. Then came the soil reports collected over decades, including the core samples my father had commissioned, showing the basin's fragility and the vital role of water in keeping it stable. Next, the correspondence emails between board members discussing how to bypass proper environmental review meeting minutes, noting their deliberate use of outdated maps, and the fake environmental company's reports designed to mislead. Every piece of paper, every photo, every time-stamped video painted the same picture, a coordinated effort to manipulate approvals and endanger the land. The room was silent as neighbors and journalists absorbed the magnitude of the deception. Karen's face tightened, her beige heels tapping nervously on the floor. Even the board members couldn't deny it. The manipulation, the fraud, the greed, it was all laid bare, undeniable, and public. For the first time, everyone could see the scale of the wrongdoing. The facade was shattered, and the power Karen had wielded so confidently was slipping through her fingers. Karen's composure finally cracked. Her red suit seemed almost too bright against the pale, shocked faces in the room, and the beige heels that had once clicked with authority now tapped nervously on the floor. The evidence was irrefutable. Maps, reports, emails, and videos showed a deliberate campaign to bypass regulations, manipulate approvals, and endanger the land. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into questions, and the HOA board member's silence spoke louder than any argument. She opened her mouth to deflect, but the room had already turned. Residents, inspectors, and journalists were watching every gesture, every twitch. Each denial fell flat against the tide of truth I had laid bare. Finally, Karen slumped in her chair, shoulders sagging, realizing that control was gone, and the accountability she had ignored for months was closing in. With the board's authority crumbling, the room collectively shifted toward resolution. I stepped forward, presenting a plan to restore the lake and stabilize the soil, integrating historical data, hydrological reports, and ecological assessments. The residents nodded, eager to reclaim the land and protect it from further exploitation. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift. Control of the land once threatened by greed and manipulation was back in responsible hands. The community could begin to heal, and Karen's reign of arrogance ended, leaving her powerless in the face of truth. The air in the valley felt lighter, as neighbors cautiously emerged from their homes, surveying the lake and the cracked earth that had once threatened their community. Conversations replaced whispers, apologies replaced silence. People shared memories of the lake before the villas of fishing mornings, childhood summers, and the quiet dignity of land nurtured by generations. Children laughed along the newly stabilized shoreline, stepping carefully over repaired soil, while adults discussed plans to protect the ecosystem rather than exploit it. A sense of shared responsibility replaced the tension and fear that had dominated for months. Slowly, the community began reconnecting, not just as residents, but as stewards of the land. Volunteers gathered to plant native grasses, stabilize the banks, and reintroduce vegetation lost to construction. There was no grand ceremony, no media spectacle, just a quiet acknowledgement that what had been nearly destroyed was now worth protecting together. The HOA faced sweeping legal consequences. Courts imposed fines for environmental negligence, and the board was held financially responsible for restoring the lake and surrounding wetlands. Depositors of the luxury villas were refunded, contracts voided, and unpermitted structures were condemned. Karen and several board members were legally restrained from making further development decisions until remediation was complete, and their influence over local zoning decisions was permanently curtailed. State and federal agencies oversaw the restoration, ensuring compliance with water rights, wetland protections, and soil stabilization standards. Every drainage pipe was removed, previously diverted inflows redirected naturally back into the lake, and soil erosion measures were enforced. For the first time in decades, accountability and law intersected with preservation, providing both justice and a blueprint for protecting sensitive ecosystems in the future. The lake slowly began to remember itself. Rain filled the basin naturally, and the gentle rush of spring-fed water returned to channels long diverted. Bulrushes and native grasses reappeared along the edges, while willow saplings took root in areas once stripped bare. Birds returned their calls, layering over the soft gurgle of water, as if the valley itself was exhaling after a long, strained silence. I stood at the water's edge, boots muddy, heart steady. For decades, this land had been both my inheritance and my responsibility. Watching it heal, I realized that protecting it required more than knowledge. It demanded persistence, courage, and the willingness to confront those who valued profit over life. Emily stood beside me, eyes wide, quietly witnessing the same restoration I had fought for. The sun dipped low, painting the water gold, and in that quiet moment I felt the weight lift. The lake, my family's legacy, and the community I loved were alive again.